who are watching. So yeah, we'll jump right in. And everybody okay? I feel like I moved very, very quickly, but you're all good. You're all in your spot. So, um, let's see here. Okay, so I'm going to take for granted that we all know the story. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time going through the Purim story. If you don't know the story, well, first of all, we're going to read it on Thursday, and there will be an English translation alongside. And if not, if you have never really read the Megillah of Esther, if you've never read the Purim story, I encourage you to do that. If you have time this week. It kind of reads like a novel actually, or like obviously like a story. So if you have time, I would recommend that you do that. But basically the reason that we celebrate and the reason that we have Mishnah that even sort of corresponds to it, and the reason for all the mitzvot that we do around Purim is because of this one verse at the very top of the page. The Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them to observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed and at the proper time each year. So that's kind of the mandate to celebrate Purim. And then everything that comes around it has to do either with the Mishnah or with the other pieces of the text. So on Purim, we are to observe 4 mitzvot. And again, we remember that mitzvot is a commandment, right? So actually we are commanded to do these 4 things on Purim. The first is mishloach manot, literally meaning giving a portion. And we've sort of taken that to mean giving gifts of some sort. So people will bake hamantashen, put them in a bag and give them to friends, giving gifts to friends. Matano le'evyonim, we are commanded to give gifts to the poor. So on Thursday, we'll have a thing on the plaza collecting food for JFCS. You can give money, you can give food, whatever works for you, but sort of giving of yourself in some way to le'evyonim, people who are poor. And the third mitzvah is mikra Megillah. So you are commanded to hear the Megillah. Of course, this year, as I guess maybe we didn't have it last year because Purim was just on the cusp of us shutting down. But of course, this year there is a tshuva, a paper, a responsa from the conservative movement. What does it mean to, quote, hear the Megillah? And can you do it through Zoom, right? So, of course, they've had that discussion in the conservative movement. If you are interested, you can definitely look that up. And then the last one is Seudat Purim. It's a festive meal on Purim. And I think of all 4 of those this year, that's going to be our hardest one. You'll have to do that one on your own. But the other ones we're going to be able to help you with in some way. So that's kind of the overview of Purim and what we're sort of going to be looking at this morning. Interestingly, the Mishnah opens with a lot about when we actually are supposed to read it. So even though it doesn't necessarily say you have to read the Megillah in the Mishnah, there's so much talk about when to read it and how to read it that we know we have to read it. Okay, it doesn't explicitly say that it's a mitzvah in the Mishnah, but we gather that from the Megillah Esther, and then because of all the rules around it in the Mishnah, we gather that it's quite important. So we'll start with Mishnah number 1. Any questions so far? Okay. So this opening Mishnah essentially teaches us that the Megillah, we know that Purim is celebrated on the 14th of Adar, which this year is Friday. But in different circumstances, you can move the Megillah around. So you can move it to a different day of the week. And so this opening Megillah is just going to teach us when we're able to do that. So the Megillah is read, Megillah nikret be'achad asar, bishneim asar, bishlosha asar, be'arba asar, be'chamisha asar, lo pachot velo yoter. The Megillah is read on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th or the 14th or on the 15th of the month of Adar, not earlier and not later. So you essentially have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You have 5 days to fit the Megillah reading in. The Mishnah explains the circumstances when the Megillah is read on each of these days. Cities, krachin, it says, that have been surrounded by a wall since the day of Joshua, son of Nun, read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. So you'll know that you probably heard that of Shushan Purim or in Jerusalem that they read the Megillah actually a day late. So that's the reason, a walled city. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the next 2 Mishnayot. we read it on a different day, whereas villages and large towns that have not been walled since these days read it on the 14th. And that's us in the diaspora. Now, here we don't really, in the United States, we don't really have such a thing as a walled city. And so we kind of just go with the non-walled version, but really for no particular reason. It's not like in Israel where you have Jerusalem is clearly a walled city and other cities aren't. In the United States, really, we don't have walled cities at all. So it's a little bit funny, but we do sort of take the, I don't know, more universal approach, if you will, and we read it on the 14th. Now we're going to get into some circumstances. Sorry, one more little piece. Eile hakfarim mikdimim liyom haknisa. However, the sages instituted that villages may advance their reading to the day of assembly, i.e. Monday or Thursday. So if this is actually quite interesting. So if you we can move it to a day that's essentially a day of Torah reading or a day when people are coming together because we want to read the Megillah within a minyan, right? So you know, an example would be let's see, like Rabbi Ain, for example, does his Torah study on Thursdays, right? We could, because there's a Torah reading that day, many people are coming anyway, and he knows he's going to get a good crowd. That's a bad example, but you see what I mean? So on Mondays and Thursdays, it was more typical for people to gather around the Torah reading. And so if you were in a village that was very, very small and you would risk potentially not gathering a minyan, you might move it to a Monday or a Thursday, assuming it's within the guidelines of the 11th to 15th of Adar, to be able to read the Megillah within a minyan and be able to actually read it. Okay, so now we're going to get into sort of the nitty gritty of the days. Yes, Catherine.
So I'm sorry, is there some explanation about why the villages and the wild cities would read it at a different time?
So in the Megillah, it says something about, and I'm going to show you that text. It literally just says, in walled cities we do it differently because Shushan, et cetera, et cetera. I'll show you the text. In terms of the villages, it takes into account the number of people, essentially. So there's an assumption that in a small village, you might not have 10 Jews. And so you might, not necessarily that you might move it to the 15th, but that you might move it to a day that's more convenient and you'll get a minyan, essentially. Yes? Okay, Ernie.
Is the 15th full moon?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Usually the middle of the month is full moon.
No, I don't know if it has to do with the moon, but I do know that this year, for example, is the 15th is on Shabbat, and so we'll move it. They'll move it this year, right? They'll move it early. So, but I don't know if the 15th of Adar is the full moon. We could look it up. It'll be in the Luach. We can look.
Well, a lot of Jewish festivals are either the beginning of the new moon or middle month.
Sure.
Full moon.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a good question. Okay. Oops. All right. So this Mishnah is going to break down basically everything that we've talked about so far. Okay. So the Mishnah explains how depending on when Purim falls, the Megillah might be read on each of these days. So how so, it asks. Ketzad, it's a tech term, Ketzad. If the 14th of Adar occurs on a Monday, the villages and large towns read it on that day, and the walled cities read it on the next day. So that's pretty self-explanatory, right? If it falls on the 14th and it's a Monday, that's easy. You go with it. You don't move it around. And the 15th is the walled cities day. Fine. If the 14th occurs on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, the villages advance their reading to the day of assembly, like we talked about, moving it up one day to Monday to get it onto a Torah reading day. Large towns continue to read it on that day because large towns assume that there's going to have a minyan and they can continue with that. And then and it says, i.e. the 14th of Adar, the walled cities read it on the next day on the 15th day. Also, that seems pretty explanatory. We're during the week. We're not worried about Shabbat. Villages are centering their readings around Torah reading days, and the larger cities are not worried about having a minyan, so they keep it on the day that they're supposed to. If the 14th occurs on a Thursday, the villages and large towns read it on that day, the 14th, and the walled cities read it on the next day, on the 15th. So I was going to say that's like this year, but it's not. We're one day off this year. If the 14th occurs on Shabbat evening, so if the 14th were a Friday afternoon or an evening, the villages advance their reading to the day of assembly. So the villages will take it up one day to Thursday, the reading of the Torah, and the large towns and the walled cities read it on that day, the 14th of Adar. Even the walled cities read the Megillah on the 14th rather than on the 15th, as they do not read it on Shabbat. And then lastly, if the 14th occurs on Shabbat, both the villages and the large towns advance their reading to the day of assembly, i.e. a Thursday, the 12th, and the walled cities read it on the day after Purim, the 15th. If the 14th occurs on a Sunday, the villages advance their reading to the day of assembly, i.e. Thursday, which is even farther back, right? That's why we have 5 full days. And the large towns read it on that day, i.e. the 14th, and the walled cities read it on the next day, the 15th. So it's a lot of detail, but it kind of makes sense, right? If you think about the different categories. Irene.
Why, just a question, why are Torah days Monday and Thursday?
Those are just the days that were established as Torah reading days. So we read Torah on Shabbat and 2 other public days, essentially, not, I don't want to say if you missed it, but like a sort of shorter reading. On Shabbat, we read the entire Parsha, and on Mondays and Thursdays, we read something shorter. And that's been for a very long time that those days have been established, so, as even in the Mishnah. So, yeah, great question. Betsy. Betsy. Oh, you're a
answer to what Iran just asked, that those were the days that were market days. So sorry. Better?
Yeah.
Okay, or no?
Yeah, it's okay.
Am I here?
Yeah.
Weren't those market days? Those were market
days. There were days
arbitrary.
That's right. There were days that people came together in public, Mondays and Thursdays. Yeah, it was but it was established in the time of the Mishnah even, that Mondays and Thursdays were sort of like a shortened reading when people were going to be together. Yeah. Great. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the when do we read. And this is the text that Catherine was asking about. This is the text about Shushan and the sort of walled villages situation. But the Jews in Shushan mustered on both of the 13th and the 14th days, and so rested on the 15th and made it the day of feasting and merrymaking. This is why village Jews who lived in unwalled towns observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and make it a day of merrymaking and feasting as a holiday and occasion for sending gifts to one another. So there's, you can see there's Shushan, and then there's this unwalled. So the 13th and the 14th were the days that they were, still in like the story was still happening. They were still in battle. And then the 15th was the day of rest, or that they were sort of over that. And the 15th was the day that they established as the day. So it says the Purim is, and the 13th is also marked in the Megillah. Purim is celebrated annually on the 14th day. And then in Adar 2, which we're going to look at in a second, it's a little bit different. Arnie, you were just asking a question about Adar 1 and 2, I remember. As in the Hebrew leap years, the day following the victory of the Jews over their enemies. In cities that were protected by a surrounding wall at the time of Joshua, Purim was celebrated on the 15th month of Adar, which is on what is known as Shushan Purim. Since fighting in the walled cities of Shushan continued through the 14th day of Adar. Today, only Jerusalem and other few cities celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar. There are cities in Israel that are apparently doubtful, that it's unclear whether they are really completely walled or not. A few of those examples are Jaffa, Sfat, and Tiberias, if you've ever been to any of those cities. And so they go with the sort of majority, which is the 14th of Adar. So they're going to read with us. But that's kind of where it gets interesting in Israel, right? Where there's actually different cities that read it on different days. We don't get that at all in the United States. We read it on the 14th or a day that doesn't correspond with Shabbat if we have to. But in Israel, there's like actually there's real thought around where we're living. And we're going to see in a Mishnah also about what happens if you travel to one of those cities. Are you supposed to say it in the way that they're there, or are you supposed to say it in the way of your hometown? Okay. Okay, keep going. Anybody have a question? I just heard maybe it's Betsy. Okay. All right, so here's the question. Here's the conversation around the Adar 1 and Adar 2. So in approximately every 3-ish years, we have an extra month of Adar. Hold on a second. Someone has a little background noise. I just want to mute. We have an extra month called Adar, interestingly called Adar 1. So actually Adar 2 is the one that is the one that's in our calendar, and Adar 1 is the one that we add. The idea is that we want to adjust the lunar calendar to keep it in sync with the solar calendar so that holidays fall approximately at the right time, right? Because certain holidays are, many of our holidays are around, are seasonal, right? So we want Passover to fall at a certain time. We want Rosh Hashanah to fall at a certain time. And so we adjust our calendar by adding a month, essentially like approximately every 3 years. And so the question is, because Purim is in Adar, what happens when there's a leap year? When do you read the Megillah, and when do you do the other 3 mitzvot? Karu et ha-Megillah be'achad harishon v'nit'abra hashana. If the people read the Megillah during the first Adar, and subsequently the year was then intercalated by the court, and now the following month will be the second of Adar, one reads the Megillah again during the second of Adar. So if you essentially, they didn't always know, like we know, okay, next year's a leap year, a couple of years from now is a leap year. Sometimes it was established kind of like on the spot, right? Because they would say, oh, this feels a little bit uneven. There wasn't foresight in their calendar planning the way that we have today. So if you read it already in Adar, and then you had to, at the last minute, you can picture, at the last minute had to add another month, you would read it again during the second Adar, because the second of Adar is the primary month of the two, I suppose. The sages formulated a principle. The difference between the first Adar and the second Adar with regard to the mitzvot that are performed during those months is only that the reading of Megillah and the Matanot le'Evyonim are performed in the second Adar and not in the first Adar. So let's see, with the mitzvot that are performed in Adar, only the reading of the Megillah and the gifts of the poor are performed. So on the second, so say you observed the first of Adar, you did all 4 of your mitzvot. When you got to the second of Adar, you didn't have to do all 4 of them again, but you do have to do Matanot le'Evyonim again, and you do have to do Mikra Megillah again. It doesn't actually say why, but what are some thoughts? I mean, the Megillah is obviously the marking of the holiday, so that one feels important, right? If you're gonna do it all over again, that you would read the Megillah, that you would read the story. The Matanot le'Evyonim is kind of an interesting one. There's not so much commentary on it, but I think that perhaps of sort of if you take the next most important one of the mitzvot, perhaps it would be that one. And so they sort of established that you have to do that mitzvah again. Thoughts? No, pretty straightforward. Okay, great. All right, so we're gonna now move in a little bit to about the language of the Megillah. This particular Mishnah does not have to do particularly with the Megillah itself, but it's kind of interesting to give us a little bit of context about when our Mishnah talks about language and the Torah and different types of text. So, ein bein sfarim litfilin umezuzah ele shehasfarim nichtativ bechol lashon. The difference between Torah scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot in terms of the manner in which they are written is that only Torah scrolls are written in any language, whereas tefillin and mezuzot are written only in Asherit, in Hebrew, using Hebrew script. So the idea here is that the Torah, actually, a Tanakh, can actually be written in a language that people can understand. So we'll see what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. Torah scrolls written in any other language do not have the sanctity of a scroll. So in the time of the Mishnah, Greek was the international language of sort of academia, if you will, and so it was also the language into which the Tanakh had been translated into Greek, and so there was an exception that actually the Torah could be written, if it was going to be written in a language other than Hebrew, it could be written in Greek. There's talk about it. Can you read the language? Can you read the Torah in any language? Can you pray in any language? I think we had that in Brachot a little bit. And generally, when you're talking about prayer, the consensus is that you can pray in a language so long as the majority of the people understand it. Which actually kind of is interesting in terms of the way that we think about today Hebrew, right? Because I would say that not everybody understands every word of the Siddur, and should we actually be praying in English more of the time? Though also you're supposed to pray in the language of the people, which we would argue in a synagogue would be Hebrew. Anyway, but so it's kind of interesting here. They're marking the fact that you can essentially say Torah in Hebrew, but also in Greek. But the mezuzah and the tefillin have to always be written in Hebrew. I think probably because those are texts that are within some sort of a vessel, right? When a mezuzah, you walk by a door, you touch your hand to the mezuzah that's in there. It's never changing. It's not being read out loud. People aren't necessarily going to see it. You just sort of know what's inside. And the same thing with tefillin. Nobody ever sees it. Nobody ever reads it. It's just, it's sort of more symbolic. And so it would be, and so to write it in any other language wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But as far as the Torah and talking about, Mondays and Thursdays as public days and really wanting to allow people to understand, it says here that actually you can write in a language other than Hebrew. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then we're going to talk specifically about the Megillah in a little bit in terms of the in the language. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. If one reads the Megillah at intervals, pausing and resuming, or while one is dozing off, one has fulfilled his obligation. So we were talking about this whole thing with Thursday with the Kahoot, right? And there's a conversation, I think it's in the halacha, that says you're not actually supposed to interrupt your reading of the Megillah, right? You're supposed to go right through. And so whether whether our game was going to be halachically permissible. And so I brought this Mishnah in to back ourselves up, just to say that it was okay to have a little bit of fun. But there is an idea that you really are supposed to read it all the way through. But here the Mishnah is differing from that opinion just a little bit. So if you read it at intervals, if you sort of stop and start, or if you're falling asleep a little bit, the Mishnah says you've fulfilled your obligation. So that's a good thing. That'll be a good thing for some of us at 7:15 in the morning on Friday. If one is writing the Megillah or expounding upon it or correcting it, and reads all the words as he was doing so, the following distinction applies. If he had intent to fulfill his obligation, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he has not fulfilled his obligation. So this has this resembles some of the texts that we read in Brachot about Shema, right? Because when we were talking about the Shema and the intention, the one that comes to mind for me was if one was reading the Torah on a Torah reading day, for example, and you happen to be reading that section in Deuteronomy where the Shema comes up, and you happen to say the Shema, but you weren't intending to say the Shema for prayer purposes. You've not actually fulfilled the mitzvah of saying the Shema. You've said the Shema, you've recited it, but you haven't actually fulfilled the obligation to say the Shema for that morning. And so that's what this Megillah text is saying. That if someone's doing something around the Megillah, if one's writing it or studying it, or what else does it say? If someone's correcting it, like a sofer is going through and making corrections in the scroll, that person has not fulfilled their obligation because they don't actually have the intent of reading the Megillah that day. And now it's going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to do this one in Hebrew, I think. Let's see. Yeah. V'im lav lo. Okay. Hayta ketuva basav uv sikra uv komos uv kantom al hanyar ve'al hadiftara lo yatsa. So these are all these materials. And if one reads from a Megillah that was written not with ink, but with sam, which is some sort of a pigment, with sikra or komos or kan katom, or from a Megillah that is written on parchment, which is not written on parchment, but some sort of other paper or something made out of something that's not intended for a scroll, one has not fulfilled one's obligation. So here we get some detail about what the scroll is actually going to look like and what it's going to, and the ink and the parchment that you have to use. And this is similar to the Torah scroll. Similarly, with the Torah scroll, it has to be a certain parchment, certain ink, has to be handwritten, and all of that. And so much so that if it's not written on those things, it actually is unkosher, and you're not allowed to read from it. One does not fulfill one's obligation unless one reads from a Megillah that is written up in Ashurit, in Hebrew, upon parchment with ink. So here is actually the Megillah, interestingly, says that you have to read it in Hebrew. And actually, there's some differing opinions about, again, like language of the sort of common language. So in the Mishnah, it tells us we have to hear it in Hebrew. And in other places, it says that you can read it in the language of the people. So if most of the congregation speaks another language, those scrolls actually the scroll itself has to be written in Hebrew. So then the question is, well, if you read it from something that's not a scroll, is it kosher? So it's kind of a strange conversation. But you'll see, in other parts of the country, you'll see Hebrew with whatever the native language is translation, right? Hebrew with Spanish translation, or Hebrew with other languages as the translation. But the actual scroll is to be written in Hebrew, unlike what we just learned about the Torah. We're moving quite quickly. Any thoughts? Usually we get 2 or 3 Mishnahs. They're pretty self-explanatory. So there's not a whole lot to talk about around it unless you have questions. Okay, quiet crowd this morning. We'll keep going. Okay. We're going a little bit backwards to the walled and unwalled towns. So with regard to a resident of an unwalled town who went to a walled city where the Megillah is read on the 15th of Adar, and conversely, a resident of a walled city who went to an unwalled town where it is read on the 14th, the following distinction applies. So now we're going to ask this question of if you were traveling. So if you live in Tel Aviv and over Purim you decide to go to Jerusalem, are you supposed to join in with the Jerusalem reading, or are you supposed to stick to your roots of Tel Aviv and make sure that you read it on your correct day? If one is destined to return to his original place, he reads it according to the halacha governing in his own place. So if you live in Tel Aviv and you go to Jerusalem for the day, but your intention is to be back in time to Tel Aviv to read the Megillah, you shouldn't read it along with the people in Jerusalem. Now that's a kind of a strange. Ruth, you're shaking your head.
But they read it the next day. So
that's right. That's right. So you wouldn't. So essentially, you wouldn't get to your. They wouldn't be reading it anyway, right? So it's kind of a strange. That's what I was about to say. It's kind of a strange construction, right? If he is not destined to return to his place, he reads it with them. So if he's going to stay the weekend, for example, right, he'll wait till the 15th of Adar the next day and he'll read it with them. The residence of his current location. Beginning from where must a person read the Megillah in order to fulfill his obligation? So Rabbi Meir says one must read all of it. So in order to fulfill your obligation, you have to read all 10 chapters, 1 to 10. Rabbi Yehuda says he only has to read it from this second chapter here, where it says there was a certain Jew in Esther verse 5. And then Rabbi Yossi says even from chapter 3. And I highlighted the yellow because Rabbi Meir is the halacha that stands. So today, in order to fulfill your obligation of Mikra Megillah, you have to hear the entire thing. This conversation around the walled and unwalled cities, it's kind of an interesting one because of what Ruth was bringing up, which is they want you to be very conscious about where you are when the Megillah is being read. I guess it would work more the other direction, right? So if a person in Jerusalem was going to Tel Aviv, right? So if you lived in a walled city and you were supposed to read it on a Friday and you traveled, I don't know, earlier in the week and you ended up in a place where they were reading the Megillah early, do you read it with them or do you wait until you get back to Jerusalem to read it with your community, within your own halachic rules? And the idea is that you're supposed to sort of think about how long am I going to be there? And when is it appropriate to read? You obviously want to make sure you're not going to end up somewhere over Shabbat because they won't read it on Shabbat. but I think that there's very, in terms of talking about the language also, and in terms of talking about this idea of travel, there is kind of there's kind of like a halacha l'makom. There's like a sense that you should be following the minhag and the halacha of your place. And I think that probably we can relate to that a little bit, right? When we have certain customs that are in our own congregation or in our own homes, that when we travel, things might be different. And the question is, do you sort of conform to to the place that you've gone to, or do you keep with your own customs, with your own halakha? And here, this is telling us that if you travel, you should stick with your home tradition, so long as you'll make it back in time to be able to actually hear the Megillah read out loud. And of course, if you can't make it to a shul, if you can't make it to a synagogue, you still have an obligation, and so you're supposed to read it. You're supposed to read it at home, and that's part of the question around Zoom. And it has been a question this entire year about what makes a minyan and what is actually sound. Does this work, right? Does this forum work? Because we're not actually in person together, and basically the tshuva, the responsa that's coming out of this year, is saying that you should read the Megillah like you read the Torah, which is that you can read it, but you shouldn't say brachot around it. And that's the same thing for when you don't have a minyan. Like if you were in person and you didn't have a minyan, you would still read the Megillah, but you wouldn't read it with a blessing. And we've seen that a couple of times, right? If when certain things that we don't do during during prayer services when we're without a minyan. And for now, as long as we're on Zoom, we're following the guide as if it's not a collective minyan. And most congregations are following in that way. Thoughts? Okay. This might be our last one.
Amanda.
Yeah, Betsy.
Amanda.
Yeah.
Are all the conservative congregations observing that, not saying the brachot for like Megillah, or is what we're doing more not the norm for right now in terms of blessings before Torah or Torah reading from a scroll or stuff like that? Are we the minority or the majority?
I would say that we're in the majority in terms of brachot online. You will see that some congregations who have b'nai mitzvah there's like this sort of strange aliyah thing that happens where people are saying an aliyah from one place, but the Torah is in another place and the reader is in another place. And it's kind of like, which to me feels a bit, people are doing what works for their community, but I would say in terms of Devar Shebekadusha, which is the things that are in our service that require a minyan, most congregations are not doing those on Zoom at the moment. And I think we talked, I can't remember, we've done so many classes. I think it was why we do this, that was a different class, but when we talked about the Kaddish, right, and how the Kaddish is an exception in most communities. I would say that the Kaddish doing one is an exception for people to be able to, and for more of like a pastoral emotional reason than a halachic reason. But yes, that most congregations are not saying brachot around Torah reading and are not saying the things in our service that require a minyan. Iran.
Can you clarify for me what it means that you don't say brachot? Is it sentences that start with blessed? What do you omit?
The simple answer to that is yes. A blessing does start with Baruch Atah Adonai, but that's not to say that we don't ever say that formula, right? Like there are places in the service that we do say Baruch Atah Adonai, even if without a minyan. There are certain places called Devar Shebekadusha, which means a thing that is sort of above or elevated in holiness, a thing that is sort of higher in holiness. For example, the Baruch Hu. The Baruch Hu is a call to prayer and also requires a bow in front of an ark. And there's a few, so we don't say the Baruch Hu, but we say the blessing after the Baruch Hu as sort of like a symbolic ode, if you will. And if you were in person and you didn't have a min, you wouldn't say the Baruch Hu either. Another example is the Kedusha. The Kedusha comes after the Amidah or within the Amidah. You don't say that one out loud either. And then Kaddish also requires a minyan.
I see.
And that's the one I was just giving as an example of one that there are multiple Kaddishes throughout a service, and we just do one at the very end. Again, as like a sort of pastoral, people should be able to say Kaddish. We're away from each other for over a year. People should be able to say Kaddish. And so most communities have adopted that practice.
Thank you.
So yeah, Ernie. And sorry, let me just say one more. And then there are certain brachot, like around the Torah reading, for example, that you don't say. And then you might have noticed that our bar mitzvahs that we've had on weekdays, a child might read the Haftarah, but is not going to say the bracha with the Haftarah either. Ernie.
When you were talking about walled cities, you mentioned Joshua at the time of Joshua.
Yeah.
And I have a problem with that because Joshua would be about, 1200 before the Common Era.
That's right.
And as far as I can figure out, the first Purim was in the 5th century. That would be 400 before the Common Era.
Okay.
So Purim happened much after the time of Joshua.
Right, but in terms of the cities being, there were cities that were walled and not. Is that your clarify?
I don't see where Joshua fits in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I looked it up quite a bit last night also because I was trying to figure out the timeline. Ernie, I knew you were going to ask that question. So I was looking also about I was trying to find some of the historical chronology of it. And I think the idea is that those cities existed, but you're right, the story maybe didn't. And I don't know why Joshua was necessarily used as the example, but it's used all over the place. I mean, it's in the Mishnah, it's in the Halacha, it's in the commentaries. And so there's some sort of a reason for connection there, and it will take, maybe we can continue to look it up together.
Okay.
Dara.
Is there another Joshua?
I don't think so. Joshua, son of Nun, is pretty pretty specific. Yeah, Dara.
We studied this, the question of the walled cities and the unwalled cities in the Talmud class on Thursday night.
Oh, there we go.
I think not this week, but the week before. And my first reaction was, this sounds like the answer in like Law and Order, at the end of the case, when you figure out, well, it couldn't have been him because he was celebrating Shushan Purim and he came from the Unwalled, it's like, would give you the reason why a person couldn't have been in a certain place at a certain time.
Oh yeah.
So it just seems like, this very arcane kind of rule that would actually give you some clues to something.
Right.
So.
Like an alibi. Like
exactly.
He's from a walled city, so he couldn't have been there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's funny.
Maybe that's why Lador Vador fits in.
Yeah, say more. What do you mean?
Well, maybe it was the descendant of.
Yeah, perhaps a descendant of Joshua. Yeah, I'm not sure why Joshua was mentioned there. I'm sure some Talmudic scholar. I'm sure Rabbi Bickert would have the answer to that question. I thought you were coming in with the answer there, so you'll have to. Yeah, Stephen. Oh, you're muted, I think. Stephen, you're muted.
I know there's a Hasidic tradition that the Israelites, before they fled Egypt, were studying Torah. So I think for a Hasidic perspective, it would make sense that there's just this mystery of continuous action with events anticipating future events. Non-Hasidic traditions, I don't know how they would deal with it.
So they've predicted Purim, and I think Ernie said 400 years. I'll go with it, but I'm not sure.
I looked it up. Ahasuerus
Yes.
was Xerxes. That was okay.
Okay.
Xerxes the Great was the son of Darius. Darius was the one who allowed the Israelites to return from Babylon. You remember?
Okay.
And so Xerxes ruled from 486 to 465 before the Common Era.
Okay. So that's why they used Joshua.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you, Ernie. Yeah, Ellen.
Well, I also wonder if the reason they use Joshua is that Joshua is the one who led us into Israel.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a little bit more of a historic context than that, but yeah, that and Lador Vador, right? Like the sort of descendants. Yeah, it's interesting. It comes up a lot. The name Joshua comes up a lot. So there's definitely some some relation, some reason there. Dara.
Well, I always associate the name of Joshua with walls. The walls came tumbling down, right? So I don't know. That seems to make sense.
That's right. Now we're getting it. Now you're all becoming commentators. You're all sort of writing the commentary to the Mishnah. It's good. Thank you. All right, let's do our. I think this is one of the last. I think this is the last one. Here we go. Okay. Now this is kind of just, it's a sort of a just ending about how to say the blessing or whether to sit or stand. So one who reads the Megillah may position oneself as one wishes, either sitting or standing. Whether one person reads the Megillah or two people read it together, they have fulfilled their obligation. So you can have, essentially the Mishnah is saying you can have one or two readers. We know that has adapted much farther than that because oftentimes you get a different reader for every chapter, and that's okay. In a place where the people are accustomed to reciting a blessing over the reading, they should recite a blessing. So this is what we were talking about before. There is a bracha associated with the blessing of the reading of the Megillah. Though in this Mishnah, it does tell us that it's kind of it's a custom, which is kind of interesting because we know now that that's not the case. That the halacha says that if you have a minyan, you should for sure say a blessing before and after. Whereas in the Mishnah, it's more about minhag. And I brought this piece of Shulchan Aruch is a halachic text. It's essentially where the halacha stands today and how we follow the Jewish law. And it says one should read the Megillah either standing or sitting, but in shul, in the first place, one shouldn't read it sitting because of the honor of congregation. So it's like you look to halacha for it to be to confirm, and the halacha here is even like a little bit unsteady. So it's sort of saying, okay, so the Mishnah says you can sit or stand, no big deal. But if you're in a congregation, out of kavod, out of respect for the community, you should probably stand up. Now, I don't know. I guess when you think about sort of Torah reading, it would be strange, right? If you were reading from a scroll, it would be strange to sit down. So it kind of makes sense. On the other hand, kind of interesting that that essentially gives you the choice. Now we could again be commentators on this piece. Let me stop the share for a second. And we could say that allows people who might not be able to stand, be able to read or whatever, which I think is nice and inclusive. The flip side of it is that you look to halacha for some sort of a confirmation on, oh, do you do this or do you do that? And as some of you have been studying with me on Tuesday mornings, when we say, why do we do this? And we go to look to the halacha for answers, and we don't always get the answers even in the halacha. So the Mishnah sort of tells us, oh, you can sit or stand. And then the halacha comes, however many years later, to say, yeah, you can sit or you can stand. And probably out of respect, you should you should be standing. And there's a whole, about with the Megillah, it's like this, it's not on a, what do you call it? Like a scroll, like the way that the Torah is, where it's very easy to roll it up. It's kind of this long piece of parchment that you roll just like you would roll up a towel or something, right? And so you kind of are constantly pulling it to pulling it out and having to hold it in a certain place. So to me, it makes sense that you would stand, but of course there are reasons why maybe you would want to be sitting. Iren.
That is kind of beautiful in a sense, what you said, because the inclusivity makes me think also of the fact that it can be written in the comprehensible language. So the same way it can be read sitting or standing, and there must be other ways that it's inclusive as well.
Right. I mean, I think the idea is that if you're going to go so far as to say that there are 4 mitzvot on Purim that you have to do, and one of those is to hear the Megillah, you want to make sure that you give as much opportunity for people to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. The mitzvah, there's that line in the Torah that says "Lo b'shamayim hi," that it shouldn't be out of reach for you. Like you should always be able to access the mitzvot and access the Torah. And if you, and a lot of our study, I think sometimes I know people have been feeling frustrated, like, if there are all these rules around prayer, how are you supposed to really, not be afraid of it or not, or do it right, or sort of fulfill the mitzvah? And here, this is sort of saying, well, there's these different ways of doing things, and so long as you read the Megillah and you are able to hear it, then you've fulfilled your obligation. And the other place that we talk about hearing versus actually reading, like, so you can hear the Megillah as well, is with the shofar, right? And there's all this conversation around the intention of that. If you're just walking by and you happen to hear it, is that really hearing it, or do you have to go in and be sort of part of the community that's blowing the shofar? And so too is the Megillah, the ideal, right? The most preferred way is to be within a community where somebody is, I guess, standing and reading the Megillah and you're able to hear it. And when we have difficult circumstances like the ones that we find ourselves in today, we are sort of going to do everything that we can that you can still be able to hear the Megillah even from your own home. And like I said at the beginning, if you haven't ever read it, front to back, if you will, from 1 to 10, it's not that long. And I would actually recommend that you do it, because it's it reads like a story. It will give you some context around why we're booing for Haman, and when we do that, and that's a much later tradition, but sort of has turned into this community event where coming together and hearing that story, just like Passover or something like that, right, has become so important and fun. We've sort of made it fun in our communities also. And hopefully we'll be able to do that this year, even on our technology. So that's what I have to offer you this morning from the Mishnah. Are there any other thoughts, questions? Sandy.
You're reading the Megillah on Friday morning at what time?
7:15.
Okay.
Yeah, 7:15 in the morning. Well, 7:15 on Friday is Shacharit. Or is Minyan, and at some point during Minyan, probably around 7:40, we'll read the Megillah a second time. You have Torah study, is that why you're asking?
Yeah, at 8 o'clock, yeah.
Yeah. So you might hear some of it.
Okay.
You'll hear it on Thursday night, though. Can you come Thursday night?
Well, online, I've got to check my calendar. Yeah.
Okay. Sandy.
Well, this was sort of